So before I start, I'd like to outline a few kind of disclaimers and just things to remind you. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that identifying languages of gender sexuality for Indigenous peoples are still problematic in Australia. And for the moment, I find it easier to utilise queer as an umbrella term for LGBT, sister girl and brother boy people, as I would use Indigenous or Aboriginal to locate the multiple and diverse cultures of Australia. And today I'll be using pictures and stories that are freely available on the internet. I make a point of noting this because I wish to never expose, out or impact on the safety of my fellow queer Indigenous people. So today's stories that I will discuss are freely available to you. And as a kind of a trigger warning, I want to make clear that the topics discussed in my presentation may align with personal trauma. With that said, I would like to also encourage those who would be so brave to speak at the symposium. I would like to remind people that in solidarity with organising bodies, presenters, fellow LGBT people and allies, that this symposium is based upon a safer spaces ideology, quite loosely, but one I'd like to kind of, promote to you. And that this symposium is also very much aware of indigenising that space and making the space inclusive not only to LGBT people, but cultural people as well. Maybe foster an environment that allows queer Indigenous identities to flourish and remind ourselves of the strength of queer identified people, our partners, friends, family and allies, and treat each other with respect and dignity throughout the event. So let me get started on my official presentation. So as a person who is queer Indigenous, I've become quite sensitive to the tensions that fissure, divide and dissolve my personal and interpersonal relationships within my community. I've had to remind my mother of my gender identity many times because she had misidentified me on one occasion. And when I confronted her, she had felt quite threatened about that. This microaggression and many other instances like this remind me of just how detached and strange I must seem to people, especially to those who know me the best. For a moment, in the point which my mother denied my identity, I felt a kind of despair of being strange and foreign. I felt like an anthropomorphic blob. I felt like an alien that I was speaking another language. I felt that no matter how many times I declare myself, my identity doesn't ever become legitimised in my mother's mind and is easily thrown into the recesses of knowledge, only to be lost in translation once again when I make myself known again. I thought, this is the person who gave birth to me. Shouldn't she be somewhat invested in who I am? Cue existential crisis, an identity crisis. So with that being said, I've started to look at the queer Indigenous body as a site of contention between worlds. And when queer Indigenous embodiment and Indigenous identity as a core collide, the constituent ideological frameworks of each signifier are called into action and question. Today I'm discussing the ways in which queer Indigenous people may be stripped of their identity and invisibilised in their sociocultural matrices. I'm claiming that queerness is somewhat systematically erased in our day-to-day cultural lives in a number of ways. And it's dependent and victim to the wide-ranging subjectivities of individuals and collectives who inform and make up that space. I'm looking at the relationship of queer Indigenous people and how they relate to themselves and to others within their community. I'll discuss variously emotionally charged and gritty adversities as told through the story of queer Indigenous people and through my own to respond to the central questions I've proposed in my abstract, which are queer Indigenous people invisibilised? How and upon whose authority are they concealed, diminished and rendered voiceless and invisible? And how important is it to be seen, known, heard and counted? This presentation is deeply concerned with power and knowledge from the standpoint of queer Aboriginal peoples. In this instance, I will utilise a part of a very complex theory of Martin Nakata's cultural interface to theorise and discuss the strategies at play here in my specific examples. Within this complex theory, I will locate the negative contours at the interface by observing objection. Objection is a multifaceted idea that describes a matrix of personal and interpersonal interactions which have marginalising effects and affects. I will utilise the notion of objectivity and its trajectories to describe the conditions in which queer Indigenous people are undone as figures at the interface. The undercurrent that I will explore challenges and transforms the cultural binary on display in the interface especially, i.e. Western and non-Western constructs. I'll deploy multiple multidimensional and interconnecting identity structures that reshape these contours and challenge identity making and thereby queer it. Aboriginal people interchangeably are queer Aboriginal people interchangeably inhabit and move between Indigenous and queer environments at one on this interface. By that very position, queer Indigenous people act as a conduit across realms, dynamic and adaptive, but they can also be victim of either. As queer identities emerge within Aboriginal family units, the extended family, across Indigenous spaces and the broader Aboriginal community, Aboriginality, has it evolved, has radically transformed and been tested by queerness. As our friend Damien, who isn't here today, highlights, the struggle to be heard in our communities is a sad plight. Where one remains unheard, there arises a risk factor of marginalisation. As our people need to be heard in every facet and layer of life on this continent, so too must LGBTI people be heard at every layer amongst our people. Although I acknowledge a range of positive outcomes experienced by queer Indigenous people and the progress that they've made within their communities, I wish to narrow my scope for the sake of clarity. The well-being of queer Indigenous peoples is often threatened, and that is something I would like to focus on today specifically. It is exposed and made vulnerable on the margin of what is already interpreted itself as a margin. In the face of compounding adversities, it is imperative that the health and well-being needs of those considered alternative be heard in that space. Some of us have stood firm, some of us are lost or gone, and most of us are yet to find our place in the order of things. So first of all, I would just like to give you a brief descriptor of myself. I come from Jerrinja Aboriginal community, which is located 1.5 hours on the south coast from here. I grew up amongst a tight knit of aunties and uncles, extended relatives, and an endless stream of cousins who influenced and shaped my understanding of identity from the beginning. Since they were rounded up like cattle on the mission, this is historically, my people have adapted to life on the margins and have retained as much culture as possible. Imposed systems such as Catholicism has fatally affected and ravaged our sense of identity by removing tradition and implementing new ways of being. We're still very much a fishing and foraging saltwater mob with a strongly branded sense of modern Indigenous identity. And there are very interesting kind of things at work in our community in that people are being propelled out in all sorts of directions, especially those identified queer in my community. I identify as genderqueer, which means from my perspective that I'm not fulfilled by the options available to me in the rigid binary system of mainstream, local, and sometimes indigenised gender labels. Do not expect me to be a man and do not expect me to be a woman. Intermediacy suits me just fine. I see gender as playful, cultural and social sets of categories which can be managed at will. And I engage with creative expressions of gender such as drag and am very much at home with my femininity. As you can see here, I have a drag and kind of what we call gender fuck in the queer community, which is generally a mixed set of male and female properties as displayed on the one body. So for me to emerge as queer and reclaim my past as queer, as a queer origin story, so to say, it's nothing short of problematic and polarising to some in my community. I've lost the connections I once had with many people, both within my community and outside of my support system. Coming out as genderqueer is still particularly confusing to people who are still coming to terms with my differing sexual identity. Sexual practice and identity was much more easier to convey to my family. Gender, however, still proves to be extremely difficult to navigate. Gender is that unspoken truth that I was born into. I was given male. I lived under regimes of masculinity. And I participated unwillingly and suffered internally for many years. I eventually dislocated myself from my community environment to complete undergraduate study over the course of approximately 5 years. As I've found my queer identity, my family have struggled to keep up. And more, I have realised that at some level, I become unavailable. I become invisible to them. And that being said, whenever there are tensions displayed about gender between me and my family or me and my extended networks, I'm always compelled to defend the gender variance of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I've had to remind those selves around me to always refer to another person as human rather than object when it comes to addressing queer people. What could be a common sense approach to social interaction, unfortunately, isn't in my spheres. It sometimes seems all too easy for somebody to denounce my human status. From my experience, the best way to navigate such a situation would be to utilise humanity in order to not malign, offend and reproduce cisgender and heteronormative values upon meeting and referring to a person you perceive to be of ambiguous gender status or as a general guide to gender etiquette. And that I have often kind of said to people, however you see me, acknowledge me as human. Beyond being male and female, I would rather be known as human than object. And that has led me down a path to explore objection and the mechanisms at play within those relationships. So I have utilised Julia Kristeva's powers of horror for Kristeva's theory of the abject. And to be clear, in this space, I'm not claiming that Aboriginal people are abject. I'm analysing the way in which queer Indigenous people are abjected in this space. That is, the casting out of queer Indigenous people. As a psychoanalytical framework, objection serves to describe the process in which one perceives purity. Objection occurs when one's subjectivities are deeply challenged, resulting in the purging of perceived impurities that will result in the maintenance of order. In my analysis, order is framed around the ways in which queer Indigenous people are constituted as impure and are rendered pure on the interface. Kristeva highlights bile, vomit and cadavers as horrific, impure sights that inspire revulsion and the compulsion to purify. Judith Butler reframes the abject in a way to understand non-normative desires as abject, meaning that non-normative sexual and gender identities are cast into the realm of the impure against the kind of founding cisgender, heterosexual and monogamous. That's a hard word. Normativities. Theorists such as Frantz Fanon use objection in his text, The Wretch of the Earth, Black Skin, White Masks, for example, to identify objection of non-white bodies as impure, and thus positioned as without value in the order of humanity. I've taken all of these positions into account to describe objection in a way that conflates compounding non-normativities, and find such a concept useful for grasping social worlds for intersectional identities such as queer Indigenous identities. And I've kind of merged that into how we can apply objection to understanding the kind of sphere of Indigenous queer identities. And my position is that diverse gender and sexual identities are not permanently or irrevocably abject. It is what constitutes them as problematic that causes objection. It is about the epistemic frameworks that are built around queer Indigenous people that may be a determinant of objection, effective oppression and acute marginalisation. And that is where I have come to Nakata and the cultural interface. Nakata's cultural interface is a model that, when applied to my topic, extrapolates on the dynamic positionalities of Indigenous people in regards to alternative sexualities and genders. As Nakata says, the interface is a multi-layered and multi-dimensional space of dynamic relations constituted by the intersections of time, place, distance, different systems of thought, competing and contesting discourses within and between different knowledge traditions and different systems of social, economic and political organisation. And it's informed, constrain, or enable what can be seen or not seen, what can be brought to the surface or sutured over, what can be said or not said, heard and not heard, understood, misunderstood, and where knowledge can be accepted, rejected, legitimised or marginalised. And I've utilised that to look beyond the Indigenous Western binary, between, where queer Indigenous topics are responsive as a trialectic space, as a space that moves between these worlds. And I find Nakata useful to project standpoints, encourage diversity from an Indigenous standpoint as a whole. And yes, and it's also been kind of placed in a way that describes the kind of tensions from the Indigenous positionality, where change happens and shapes our trajectories as Indigenous peoples as a whole. And so I've come to kind of markers of objection in queer Indigenous specific lives, especially starting with coming out, I think is an important marker for queer identity making for Indigenous people. It could lead to emancipation, but for some, lives hang in the balance. For Rob, his story of resilience depended entirely on the way that his community saw him. He says, "When I came out, I felt the biggest weight left off my shoulders. It does take time. I knew who I was around 17, but it didn't come out till 22. It took a little time to overcome the internal voices of self-doubt when you live closely with people in community. Even when it is accepted, it's hard." And I've kind of opened up the idea of coming out as a kind of ongoing process as you lift the veil in your everyday life. It happens at every community and family gathering, every cultural event. You must come out. It happens every time you remind your extended relatives of your place in the world. Coming out is something you have to do many times in your life, as you realise that your identity is not default knowledge. And in the case of gender, coming out is very much a day-to-day struggle. that one must navigate. And at each moment, even the anticipation of objection in these cases is all-consuming. I just wanted to let her speak for herself in this instance.
Trying to be myself every day and going out in public is really daunting. I get days where I just don't want to go out. I'll drive to the supermarket and then I'll decide not to go in because of all this paranoia, because of experiences that I went through, you know, like, and listening, hearing stories from other people going through that sort of thing, discrimination and that, you know, getting teased or getting, you know, hurt because of who they are. And I think really the biggest challenge for me being sister girl is every day is just using public toilets. I get really uncomfortable going into a male's toilet, and you know, and then I just get uncomfortable going into a female's toilet because you don't know how they're gonna take you, you know. So I just go straight for the disabled toilet, you know. But yeah, it's just, you know, that's just an everyday little challenge for me.
And that is a kind of story that I myself have connected with sister girls on, specifically during times when I am dressed female-bodied. That even the anticipation of objection in those spaces inspires you to shut down and not contribute to those spaces in ways that you could function and serve in your kind of regular day-to-day. And a definite contributor to that kind of process is isolation, and in the path of coming out, and especially involving family life. As discussed here, when making the decision to come out, we often feel a sense of isolation and disconnection to the country we identify with, and the location we identify a kinship, often resulting in drug and alcohol dependency to suppress feelings connected to the whole coming out process. There is a mental challenge to balance culture, connections, land, sexuality, acceptance within our kinships. So we've got a quite great, we've got a system of culture to allow to be able to see us and to kind of overcome before we ourselves branch out and flourish. And Crystal, one of our more formidable sister girls, talks about cultural bullying, disempowerment by family, and people having to dislocate themselves from community. And that's a story that kind of resonates with me, as I have done so myself. And that's kind of helped me to look at kind of abject violence as a layering of this intersection. And from an anonymous source, I was confronted when they told me that when they came out to people and when they have intimate relationships with a man, they don't know if they'll be kissed or they'll be killed. And that is extremely emotional for me to deal with. But to step back, I've kind of looked at queer Indigenous bodies as phobic objects, and that it is about the epistemic frameworks around them that kind of creates them as the phobic object. So the choice of the phobic object is overdetermined. Such an object does not come out of the void of nothingness. In some situations, it's previously evoked an effect in the patient. The phobia is a latent presence of this effect on the core of his world. For the object naturally need not be there. It is enough that somewhere the object exists. And it's a possibility, such an object is endowed with evil intentions. And that works around the mentalities of queer Indigenous people who anticipate those aggressions, threats and violence in everyday lives. And here specifically, I've noticed that it has merged onto my on-campus life. I noticed that in a toilet space, in a public space, there were inclusive signs talking about gender diversity and not harassing people who may seem to be gender ambiguous. Whereas the first, the one to your left, is kind of attempted at. It is not quite as ravaged as the one situated behind the door, which reads the words fags and we do not care. Well, from the perspective of Indigenous people, Stephen Lindsay Ross notes that homophobia still finds fertile ground in our communities. When you're Aboriginal, you're always reminded of your difference, from the sideways glance of a shop assistant to the excitable look of school children when you're delivering a welcome to country. When you're Aboriginal and gay, there are layers of difference, and this can be challenging for some people. For Laura, it's an extremely confronting process. She is a sister girl, and she has had to deal with threats of violence. She says, I used to play girly things with dollies at the beach. This is how I like to be, but not in front of my mum and dad. They used to come and hit me with a stick and a hose. I tried to talk to Dad and make him understand, but he said he would take me down to the bush and shoot me with a gun and leave me there. When you have your home, when you don't have a home to turn to, who do you turn to? It's ongoing. Stephen Lindsay Ross once again says when he came out to his father, he told me he used to bash people like me. Whenever we fought, homophobic insults were not off limits. I've seen this prejudice in other families in Deniliquin too, and reinforcing the idea that queer Indigenous people are everywhere, that even in my community, in Stephen's community, as Coyle noted, queers are everywhere. And there is also the tension around sexual objectification, as I read in from The Empty Mirror. There is a slur that was once used historically in the far north, where men would objectify black women as black velvet, and kind of around that there's been an ongoing fetishization of queer Indigenous bodies around that term. And that is from People in the Empty Mirror. That's throughout history, those kind of abject experiences were mapped out onto national borders and racial and gendered identifications, and the management of sexual practices of the coloniser and the coloniser was kind of fundamental to the order of things. And I have adapted that idea of the ongoing kind of compounding fetishization, and have seen that being projected into the queer community as a whole, and as experienced in people in the Empty Mirror. It was and still has been used. So I've also used that kind of psychoanalytical term, cognitive dissonance, as a kind of means of revealing abject violence within the Indigenous psyche. Quite recently, in 2013, Aboriginal leaders sent in a note applauding the High Court's decision to reject homosexual marriage in Canberra. They wrote, Aboriginal people, the First Nation people of Australia, have a strong culture of heterosexual marriage and have practiced marriage between male and female for thousands of years, long before white men came to this land. Homosexuality was never accepted in our culture. Change came with the introduction of Western culture. Redefining marriage would change the whole meaning of marriage, from traditional Aboriginal marriage between a man and a woman to two people of the same sex. This is not the true Australian way. And from my position, I see that as a cognitive dissonance, because it filters through heteronormative values that have been projected onto us and have ignored our diverse historical kind of organisations such as polygamy and boy wives, which is a kind of underexplored area of diverse Aboriginal sexualities. And it's ongoing, and it questions queer Indigenous authenticity as being Aboriginal. This happened quite recently and quite publicly. Anthony Mundine reviewed ABC's Redfern Now, and one of their shows was themed homosexual. He said, watching Redfern Now, and they're promoting homosexuality like it's okay in our culture. That ain't in our culture, and our ancestors would have their head for it. Like my dad told me, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Now, if those are aren't contradictory, I don't know what is. But luckily, we do have people in our community who come to our defence and defend us, saying that gay people and that it denies all of our identity to ourselves, especially, and it's insulting to us and extremely inappropriate. And another dynamic that kind of situates itself internally is kind of the issues of suicide, adulation, and a range of those things, especially in the Veronica Baxter case, a trans Indigenous woman found dead in a cell in a men's prison of March 2009. So 2 days later, this was around Mardi Gras season, around this time of the year, when she had used a bed sheet to hang herself from a top bunk bed in her cell while awaiting classification. And this classification system ignored her trans identity, ignored the fact that she was under kind of medical transition as well, and also her calls for help were unheard and unrecorded when it came to court and supplying evidence. And I find suicide quite difficult to work around because of this lack of statistics, especially to obtain for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and queer people who are treated as a separate category within those frameworks. So it's hard to gauge how many queer Indigenous people are actually taking their lives. And the internal struggle goes on with ideas like gender dysphoria and the self-objecting ways in which people are managing emotion and stress. And Crystal particularly highlighted that. She said, I'm 30 plus years old, never once used my penis to penetrate another person. I'm trapped in something I'm not. It's hard, you know. She indicates that for her gender, she wishes to reject the male body and seek medical intervention. And that's a kind of internalised self-objection that occurs. And an interesting question that comes back to suicide is that, you know, whether the white man will or can see me. There is no data. So when you're queer and Indigenous, you think no one cares, no one will see us. There are public there are health inclusive strategies and inclusive strategies all over the place within the queer community, but there still seems to be quite a disjuncture when it comes to ideas about race and understanding the race to be culturally inclusive. And especially working in the field, particularly in Australia as an academic, it's quite difficult to legitimise the stories of queer Indigenous people. I've come across many instances where I felt kind of insecure about presenting information as legitimate in that space. And I'm going to kind of finish up the last leg with the idea of emancipation and survival that includes us too. We're a part of the Indigenous community, and a factor that we have to account for interculturally, and kind of mediate that space and talk about it more. And a really interesting development within queer Indigenous people who have been cast off by objective forces is that there have become kind of models of hybrid queer kinships happening. There are nominal kinship systems developing out of these people who have maybe been objected from their communities, who have come together and who have talked about their obligation to both culture and to their sex gender diverse communities, and have created an autonomous and quite strong space. And particularly the Tiwi sister girls. They're an extraordinary community of what would be loosely translated as transgender, male to female, Indigenous identities. They've kind of gathered and have created a grassroots level activities that have kind of spread out within the last 4 years and have grown quite visible, especially in mental health. And I'd like to think that disidentification is one of those kind of positive things used by queer Indigenous people as intentional and subversive interventions against objectivity. So disidentification is meant to be descriptive of the survival strategies of minority subject practices in order to negotiate phobic majoritarian public sphere that continuously leads or punishes the existence of subjects who do not conform to the phantasm of normative citizenship. So we have a lot of queer Indigenous people who would rather transformation at the interface rather than integrate, rather than become these normative subjects. They wish to transform Aboriginality to be aware of queer identities and inclusive rather than to integrate them into the body of what we currently know as Indigenous in Australia. And then really cool illustration of that are the titters. Especially through humour, I love the way that they subvert the kind of sexual identities of Aboriginal men by claiming whatsits then slut. Well, what is quite subversive, and you can kind of construct discussions about like slut shaming in culture and how that has kind of moulded its way into our society. We can kind of look back on it as and kind of enjoy the same space with non-queer Indigenous people by coming together in comedic kind of spaces such as this. So there's always the call for help from queer Indigenous people who are being objected. And what we currently have are a system of grassroots developments, such as the thumb drives there, which give the Sister Girl documentary and various other gender diverse documentaries to remote communities, and that relieves some of the social tensions by allowing Indigenous cisgendered people to kind of see into the world of transgender lives within their own community, and reveal it in a way to them that they might kind of become more inclusive. And we also have Black Rainbow, and especially on the far right there, we have kind of inclusive strategies that are Indigenous built, where they challenge women's shelters to be more trans inclusive and to be more gender diverse in that space. And they've especially used the local language as well to reinforce the idea that Indigenous people are within these structures of power and they are there waiting for you to seek help. And that is a really beautiful thing when you're a trans Indigenous person who has been dislocated from your home. And personally, I have created my own project, which is a portal for queer Indigenous people to seek out representations of themselves as found online. A lot of the representations I have included here do come from my kind of archive project. So that is something that I would like to promote, so that when Indigenous people do feel abject, they can come to this space and find people just like them. And to kind of finish on a really positive note, I really enjoy the notion that while we might feel a disjoint from tradition and being non-normative and being oppressed on an ongoing kind of heteronormative landscape, that we are ancestors too. I would like to quote Ahimsa, Timoteho Bodran. She writes, "We have spent many years looking for our ancestors, looking for those native and brown people who loved as we did, who moved in the world and created a space for us. Part of our queer genealogy involves not only finding those voices in our lineage, in our nations, but in recognising the way we are becoming those we have sought, and the importance of recording our stories for those coming after, and making the journey with, for we are not only descendants, but ancestors ourselves." So in transforming the space, I think it's really important to note that we are the owners of our culture too, and we can contribute and change practices for the future, and no longer marginalise how can I express it? And kind of fight against those intercommunity and sometimes really difficult positions to talk about, because it's always really hard to criticise from within, especially when you're in a marginalised space. So, yeah, I'm finished.